Good morning and welcome to Southern Tier Gardening. My name's Eric. I live in South Georgia, hardiness zone 8B. I got a lot of work done this past weekend in the garden. I've got a small project going on this morning, so I thought it would be a good opportunity to do a video, show you guys what I've got going on in the gardens, and I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically, a little bit more in depth this morning about terminating my warm season cover crop. Okay, so let's get started. As you guys know, I have two in-ground garden plots in my backyard. Each one of those gardens measures 15 by 25. And I also, over here close to the house, I have a small herb garden where I grow some vegetables, flowers, and herbs. And everything over here I grow in containers. You can see I have a mum growing. So let's get started. This past weekend, you can see right here, I got some lettuce planted. This is the first time I've tried growing lettuce. But it grows really well down here in the cool weather. In this first container, I planted these as transplants, and I have 6 plants here of a red leaf lettuce, and the variety is called New Red Fire. And you can see these little plants, really kind of cool looking leaf lettuce. And in this container, I have 6 heads of romaine lettuce growing. Now, lettuce you can grow or harvest kind of 2 different ways. You can let these plants go to full maturity and basically form a nice big head of lettuce and cut the entire head of lettuce off after about 50 days. Same with these romaines. These will eventually grow up and form nice big heads of lettuce. Or throughout the growing season, you can harvest just the leaves off of the plants, sort of harvesting the leaves that are lower on the plant, and the plant will just continue to grow. So you can have a longer harvest as opposed to just harvesting one plant at the end. I'm going to harvest leaves throughout the growing season, kind of as I need, harvest some for a salad for dinner. And I'm hoping this works out for me. I've got them in these nice big containers. This area of the yard gets partial shade, which lettuce likes. So we'll see how that goes. I'm pretty excited about that. The only other thing that I have growing over here now is my cayenne pepper plant. This plant is still doing really well. I have lots of peppers still growing on this plant. This plant will continue to produce peppers really until my first frost, which is usually around Thanksgiving time. So I've been fertilizing this container and just enjoying all these wonderful cayenne peppers that I've been harvesting. Okay, so now we can walk over here to this garden plot on this side of the yard. If you guys remember, this is where I had my sweet potatoes growing. My sweet potatoes were all in here. I also grew Cherokee tan pumpkins in this garden, and I grew okra in this garden. But all those plants have been removed, and this past weekend I planted my winter transplants. All these plants that I have growing in this garden now are very frost tolerant. What you want to do, timing, is you want to plant these, at least in my area, usually in October. You want to be a good 5 or 6 weeks before your first frost. Because what you want to have happen is you want these young transplants to grow and get mature or get a little size to them. If these plants right now, they're very small, very young. If I were to have a frost it could kill these plants, even though they're cold tolerant. But once they get established and get growing larger, they can survive our frosts here. And all these plants I will grow in this garden, and I will overwinter them. And so they will grow, November, December, and I'll be harvesting most of these vegetables in the middle of January. So I can talk to you guys about what I planted. This first double row right here, these 12 plants are broccoli. Now, every season I like to try to grow new things just to challenge myself and for the variety. So broccoli is a crop that I've never grown, but I'm going to give it a try this year. The variety of this broccoli is called Green Magic, and I have 12 transplants. This next row right here is a row of green cabbage. This is what cabbage plants look like when they're very young and transplants. The variety of cabbage that I'm growing this season is called Bravo. I grew Bravo cabbage last year, and it was by far the best variety I've ever grown. They produced huge heads of cabbage. They were very disease resistant. The pests didn't get after them, so I was very pleased with that variety. This next row, these are probably my favorite winter crop to grow. These are my collard greens. I grow a variety called Georgia. It's just a hardy, easy to grow vegetable. I think everybody should be growing collard greens. It is by far the easiest plant, in my opinion, to grow. You just pretty much put them in the ground, and you're going to be harvesting collard greens all the way through your, March. And then next, I have another double row of Bravo green cabbage. I love cabbage. I like making coleslaw with it. I make homemade sauerkraut. I give a lot away. I just enjoy growing them. I like visually how cabbages look when they're growing in the garden. They're just cool. So I'm growing basically 24 cabbage plants. And then lastly over here, this is another new variety for me, or a new crop. This row here, single row, these are rutabaga. Now, I've only recently tried rutabaga, and it's a vegetable I really enjoy eating. They're like a turnip, but it's a lot milder. I like them roasted in the oven. I like them mashed. So I decided this year, some gardeners I know have a lot of luck growing rutabagas in my area, so I wanted to give them a try and just for the fun of it, see if I could grow them. So I have 12 of those plants going. So I was super excited to get these plants in the ground this past weekend. To get this garden space ready for planting, I tilled up all the soil, got it nice and loose. I added lots of compost, and I also added quite a bit of 10-10-10 all-purpose fertilizer. Just spread that over the entire garden space and put these transplants in. Now, if you look down here on this end of the garden, you can see where the darker compost soil ends, and you can see towards the back of the garden, I don't have anything planted. The reason is in the winter time, I have a really large live oak tree that grows in my backyard. And in the winter time, when the sun is lower in the horizon, this back space of this garden gets a lot of shade. In my opinion, it doesn't really ever get enough sunlight to really grow these vegetables successfully. I've done it, but like the cabbages are real small. I had a couple collard green plants die. So this year, I stopped my transplants. That line literally is where the sun ends. So this side of the garden gets lots of sun. Back there does not. So you guys know me though. I'm not going to be able just to leave this part of the garden space bare and open. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plant a winter cover crop right here. I'm going to broadcast some seeds, probably winter greens, probably a mixture of collard greens, kale, and mustard greens. And I'll just spread the seeds over this entire space of the garden and see what happens. Seed is very cheap. I can get enough seed to cover that spot for about $2. I'm just going to throw it in there and hope for the best. I think I'll have enough sunlight to grow some small winter greens. And that way this soil isn't just exposed. The cover crop will help keep the weeds at bay. And who knows, maybe I'll get to harvest some nice winter greens from that spot of the garden. But I decided not to put any of my actual big vegetables back there because it just doesn't get enough sunlight. But anyway, like I say, all these plants are about, 80 days to maturity. So these will just stay in the garden, and I'll be harvesting these vegetables, around Christmas time, into January. So now we can go over to this side of the garden, and just to recap, if you guys remember, this was the garden space this spring and summer, where I grew yellow squash over here. I grew eggplants, peppers, cucumbers, tomatoes, and around late July, when those plants were all removed, I planted a warm season cover crop over here. And I planted a crop of purple hull peas. And I wanted to talk to you guys today. Today what I'm doing is I've terminated that cover crop. So what I do is, if you come over here, these plants got to be about a foot and a half tall. So the first thing I do is I take my push mower and I set the deck sort of on the highest setting, or maybe a notch or two down from the highest setting. I actually went about in the middle, and I just mulched. You want to make sure you have your mulch cover on it, so the mower is just cutting the stuff up and mulching it and dropping it right to the ground. And this is what it looks like after it's been mowed. You guys can see it just breaks up and chops up all those purple hull pea plants and drops them right down to the ground. And this is the material. This is what I'm after. This is why I plant cover crops, because all this green material now will break down, it will decompose, and it will incorporate into the soil. And that's what you want. The difference between soil and dirt is soil is alive. Soil is an ecosystem. That's what you're trying to create in your garden. You want fungal life, you want microorganisms, you want worms, you want your soil to be a healthy, living ecosystem. As opposed to dirt, dirt is dead. Dirt is like sand at the beach. But soil is what you're trying to build as the foundation for growing vegetables. And incorporating these cover crops, this green manure, into the soil is a great way, in my opinion. It's probably the number one thing that I do in my garden spaces to build good, healthy soil. So like I say, the first step I did this morning was I mowed all this down. And after that, you can see my garden hose here. You want to water this really well. You want to just, you don't want this to be dry. You can see here, I'm gonna just wet this garden space down really good here. Make sure it's nice and wet. After I do that, you can see right here I have a black plastic tarp. I have 2 of these. I'll unroll this tarp and I will cover this entire garden space with this black tarp. What the tarp does is it, most importantly, prevents weeds from growing in this space. until I plant it, because I couldn't really come in here right now and start planting into this soil. You can see the material from the purple hull peas, the plant material still needs to die and to break down in the soil. So the tarp will speed that process up. And when you put a tarp on your garden space, you don't want the soil to be really dry. That's why I water it really well, because the water will help to start to break down that material, and it'll decompose and it'll incorporate better into the soil. So later today, after the video, I'll cover this entire garden space with this black tarp, and I'll leave it covered for about 2 weeks. Then after 2 weeks, I'll remove the tarp, I'll come in here and I'll till up the soil and mix that, what's left of that plant material, back into the soil. Then I'll be ready to plant this garden. Now, my original plan, I was supposed to have this done about 3 weeks ago, because my original plan was to plant all those vegetables on this side. And one of the main reasons I chose to grow purple hull peas as a cover crop is because they're a legume. In other words, they're a family of plant. They're a nitrogen fixer. So not only am I getting the benefit of all this green material into the soil, these plants are also going to add a ton of nitrogen back into the soil. And nitrogen, in my opinion, is the most important nutrient, or what's the word I'm looking for, element that plants need to grow healthy. Nitrogen is what causes plants to grow nice and green. It promotes the green vegetative growth of your plant. So when you're planting things like cabbage and root and collard greens, you're basically growing leaves. So my original plan was to have all this soil full of nitrogen for planting. But as I talked to you guys, I had never grown purple hull peas before, and I couldn't believe how well they did, but they just took longer to get to maturity than I expected. So I just couldn't wait any longer, because like I say, I still have 2 more weeks that this garden space has to be under the tarp before I can even think about planting. And if I were to wait 2 more weeks to plant all of those vegetables over there, it would be too late in the year. I would be risking it being too close to my first frost. So I changed my mind. I planted all those vegetables over there. And now, after a couple weeks on this side, I'm going to plant, well, I haven't really decided. I have a few options. I'm definitely going to be planting a lot of onions over on this side now. I grew onions last year over on the other side and was successful. So this year I want to increase both the number of onions I grow, and I'm going to increase the varieties of onions I grow. Last year I only grew red onions. This year I want to grow red onions, and I want to also grow some Vidalia sweet onions. So I'm going to be growing some onions on this side, and I will also be growing a cool season cover crop on this side. Similar to what I talked to you guys about earlier, I'm going to do a mixture of winter greens. I'm going to cover this garden with, I'll broadcast seed, and I'll do collard seeds, mustard green seeds, and kale seeds. I'll do a mixture in the space of the garden where I don't have my onions, and that will provide some nice winter greens throughout the winter to eat. So I'll have some really healthy greens, and that cover crop will grow all the way through next spring, and I will terminate that cover crop next February-ish, and then this garden space will be ready to plant next spring. So everything should work out. I kind of, talking about purple hull peas, I wanted to show you guys something pretty interesting. These purple hull peas, this is the cool thing about gardening, is you can, it allows you to harvest your vegetables or your crops at different stages in its life. You can harvest things that are very young, or you can let things go till they get very ripe and harvest them very mature. But if you look at this plate, these look like green beans, and I've talked to you guys about these, but these are the young purple hull peas. You can see they really haven't started to form the peas on the inside of the pod. This is one stage that the plant can be harvested as. And if you look, these are basically just green beans at this point. I harvested, last week we had some cold weather, so I had to come in here and I had to harvest all of these beans while they were still young because I didn't want to risk losing them to the frost. But you guys can see this is what they look like when they're not quite mature. They're still young, but they're fully edible at this point, and they taste delicious. They taste just like green beans. I've been cooking them in stir fries and just steaming them. They're absolutely delicious. But if you let the plant continue to grow for a few more weeks and mature, this is why they call it a purple hull pea. You can see how much bigger it gets, and the hull turns this really pretty dark purple color. And at this point, you wouldn't eat this pod. What you do is you split the pod open almost like you do English peas, and this is what you harvest, the actual purple hull peas. And when most people are familiar with this vegetable, you think about black-eyed peas, you're going to get them in a can or you get them dried. But this is actually what a fresh picked purple hull pea looks like. And I never thought that I would have enough time growing this cover crop as far as days before I needed to terminate the cover crop. I never thought that I would get any peas at this stage. But today when I was in there mowing, I noticed that I had a few that went to maturity. So I just picked them and wanted to show you guys. This is actually why most people grow this plant. Most people aren't going to pick them as green beans. They're going to let them fully mature so they can harvest these amazing fresh purple hull peas. They're absolutely delicious. You cook these down, they're just so good. So I just wanted to kind of show you, the young example of when the plant is real young, and an example of what they look like when they're fully mature. So anyway, that's about all that I got to talk about today. Like I say, later this morning, all I have to do now is just unfold this tarp. I use some stones that I keep and I use these 4x4 posts. I keep those to hold the tarp down so it doesn't blow away in the wind. And I'll keep this garden space covered, like I say, for about 2 weeks. And then in, early to mid-November, I'll plant a winter cover crop over here. So anyway, that about wraps it up for today. I'm glad I was able to show you guys around. I was able to get some time in for this video. So, looking ahead, I will be talking to you guys down the road about planting the winter cover crop over here. And I'll be showing you guys, bringing you along and show you how these plants are going to be doing over on this side of the garden. So I'm super excited. I got a lot done this weekend, and I can't thank you guys enough for watching my videos. I really enjoy showing you guys what's going on and talking to you about how I garden in South Georgia. So anyway, I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next time at Southern Tier Gardening.